Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today I have as my guest once again John Ziegler. John is a podcaster, documentary filmmaker, and political commentator known for his fierce critiques of media bias and institutional narratives. He's been a conservative talk radio host, notably on KFI Los Angeles, and produced films like Media Malpractice: How Obama Got Elected. He's also hosted the podcast With the Benefit of Hindsight, which made the shocking claim that Jerry Sandusky of Penn State sexual abuse infamy was in fact completely innocent, as well as Joe Paterno and others caught up in that moral panic. And that's a claim I believe he proved conclusively. John currently hosts the podcast The Death of Journalism, exposing major journalistic failures. And he's here today to tell us about what he believes is yet another one hiding in plain sight. John, great to have you back.
Tom, thanks for having me.
So the current moral panic, if that's what it is, concerns the so-called Epstein files and the failure by the Trump administration to release the infamous Epstein client list. Now, the left is very much interested in this because they believe that once this client list is released, that it's going to incriminate Trump, finally bring him down where all of the previous scandals have failed to do so, while kind of the right is kind of split between those who just are going to stand by Trump no matter what, and those even among his MAGA base who believe he's either protecting friends, they don't believe he's guilty, or maybe protecting some connection to Israel and Israeli intelligence. Which side of this argument is correct?
Well, I think everybody's wrong on what happened here. And I think this is one of the more fascinating and baffling media narratives of our modern times. And we've had a lot of them. And I think I'm kind of uniquely, you've already alluded to it with regard to my Penn State, Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky experience. I'm kind of uniquely suited to understand what's really happening here and what's not happening. I think that the key element of this entire Epstein saga, and to be clear, I believe Epstein was guilty. And the reason why I believe Epstein was guilty is not just because of the evidence against him, but because he killed himself. And he killed himself of sound mind and body. He clearly planned to do it. I believe he even practiced to do it. He changed his will right before he did it. The evidence is overwhelming that he killed himself. But the problem is that is not an accepted reality in the public narrative. Even some in the news media don't seem to be 100% sure that he actually killed himself. There's this perception that he was murdered. And that perception began, weirdly enough, on the MAGA side of the equation. And the reason why this is so odd is that if you understand just the basic realities of the story, Epstein killed himself while Donald Trump was president. Epstein killed himself while Donald Trump's Attorney General, Bill Barr, was in charge of the federal prison system where Epstein killed himself. So if he was murdered, that's an awfully odd scandal to be, having your cult leader, Donald Trump. And I'm a conservative, but I'm no Donald Trump fan. It's always been very odd to me that MAGA embraced this narrative that Epstein was murdered because of the obvious implications to Trump himself, or at least his attorney general. Not to mention that at the best, Trump would have to be an absolute imbecile to not be able to figure out what was happening and not be part of this cover-up of this murder of Jeffrey Epstein in a federal prison. And the alleged murder plot, Tom, is really at the center of this entire misperception. Because people think he was murdered or not sure that he wasn't murdered, they presume, well, okay, why would he be murdered in a federal prison, and how could someone possibly get away with that? The only way that makes any sense is if he has been killed by powerful, incredibly powerful people because he has some sort of dirt on them, right? And so if you follow this conspiracy narrative, it makes a little bit of sense in that, okay, and I'm the first to acknowledge, if he was really murdered in a federal prison and somehow we never even had a suspect, that would be consistent with a massive, massive conspiracy. And that this would be consistent with the idea that there's all these very powerful people that are terrified of this so-called Epstein list coming out, and that Epstein had dirt on all these people, and that therefore this really was this massive elite sex trafficking operation. And that's why these files might be protected. And that's why we have so much anticipation for what might be in them. But I think this is all based on a fallacy, because Epstein was not murdered. He killed himself. He killed himself. And if you accept that he killed himself, which he obviously did, the entire story changes dramatically. And if you understand that he killed himself, and if you understand that because of that, there was a moral panic, that he didn't really pay for his crimes. People needed someone to pay for his crimes. And then Prince Andrew does that stupid BBC interview and gets run over by a Mack truck because he's completely unprepared. He's a zoo animal that has lost all of his natural survival instincts, being a member of the royal family. He does a lousy job in the interview. I believe the evidence is overwhelming that Andrew was innocent, but it gets perceived that he's guilty because the royal family, much like Penn State did in the Paterno-Sandusky situation, pleads guilty for things that never actually happened. So now people think, we've proven that Prince Andrew is guilty. Then you have Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's associate, having a trial in the middle of the COVID panic, which was a joke. I have no idea whether Ghislaine Maxwell was guilty of helping Epstein in the sex trafficking or not. I don't know. But I do know that her trial was a joke. It was an embarrassment. But then she gets convicted. So now people in their brains have this narrative. Oh, so this is all consistent with what I, for some reason, want to believe, that there was this massive elite sex trafficking operation, because we've got Prince Andrew in their minds pleading guilty, even though it's not what happened. We've got Ghislaine Maxwell being convicted. So therefore, that substantiates our beliefs about Epstein. When in reality, what we really have here is, in my view, Epstein hired a lot of prostitutes, some of whom were underage. He escaped one time. The second time he realized that the jig was up, he killed himself in a federal prison, and everything has just gone screwy since then. We've lost all sense of proportion for this story, and I don't believe that there's going to be anybody criminally implicated in these Epstein files. Now, there's going to be, I'm sure, some people that are going to be destroyed, because anybody's name that's in there now is going to be radioactive. We've already seen that with Larry Summers, the former president of Harvard, in these emails that were released from the Epstein estate. But I don't believe there's going to be any real significant hard evidence of anyone else's criminality. And then, of course, when that is the reality, Tom, what people are going to say is, oh, well, they scrubbed the real files, or they've redacted too much. The real truth is still out there. No one is going to accept the reality, because this narrative has gotten so big that it's too big to fail. This narrative is too big to fail. It will not fail. There are too many people in the media and in this public that are deeply, deeply invested, for reasons that I find fascinating but frustrating, in this ridiculous narrative for which there's no logic or evidence. And it's really just a testament to how totally broken our entire media industrial complex is, and how broken our society is, and how these massive narratives can be accepted by a huge portion of the public, even though there's no logic or evidence to support them.
Well, you said quite a bit there. And there's so many links in the chain, and I want to get to a few of them that are really important, including the trial of Maxwell. First, let me just say where I've been on this since Epstein didn't kill himself became a meme. And that is that, like the Sandusky thing, I kind of just, accepted the general narrative. I didn't really care about it that much. I didn't care about Sandusky at the time. I care about it a lot more after your podcast because I do believe an innocent man's in jail. But with this Epstein thing, I was like, well, yeah, that suicide seems awfully fishy and the camera's not working and all that kind of thing. But, I'm a libertarian. And what I care about, if anything good is going to come out of the Trump administration, which I had very qualified, realistic expectations for, it would be that the government got smaller. He was talking about getting, at least scaling down some of the regulatory state, that the foreign policy might be a little bit better. I didn't expect miracles because I didn't expect much from Trump, but I thought it would be better. And I thought there might be a few other wins amid many losses. And how in the world is getting to the bottom of the Epstein case going to affect any of that? So I didn't care about it, but I did kind of, assume that there's something fishy about it. So now I'm starting to wonder, is there really something fishy about it? I listened to your podcast, and by the way, everybody, episode 268 on John's podcast, The Death of Journalism, is available, the whole thing in its entirety without a paywall. So I encourage you to go and listen to that. Let's start with one link in the chain. You said the Maxwell trial was a sham. Why is that?
Why was it a sham, or why do I believe it was a sham? In other words,
why do you believe it was a sham? Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, people would be shocked to know that by far the most well-known accuser of both Maxwell and Epstein, Virginia Giuffre, did not testify at Maxwell's trial. She did not testify because the prosecutors were so terrified of putting on the stand because she's clearly not credible. She's the number one accuser of Andrew. She's the number one accuser of Maxwell. She's the most prominent accuser of Epstein, and she did not testify. In fact, almost no one testified this trial. I believe they had only 4 accusers testify. It's difficult to determine how you define accuser, but their allegations were unsubstantiated. At times they were vague. Her treatment during this trial, partially because it happened during the whole COVID panic, was inhumane. Inhumane. I mean, they literally would not let Maxwell sleep for more than 15 minutes at a time. So she was in no condition to testify on her own behalf. The entire process, partially because of COVID, partially because of the Epstein moral panic, was an absolute farce. The media coverage was pathetic. In fact, part of how you might find this interesting, Tom, I didn't care much about the Epstein case, really, until I saw an ABC 2020 on the Maxwell part of the case. And I kept thinking, this is it? This is something. Her, and she's going to spend the rest of her life, for all intents and purposes, in a federal prison for these crimes that if they existed, if they happened, certainly were not proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But because, and this is what happens with these massive media narratives, they feed on themselves. They become too big to fail, and everyone they touch gets run over. And it certainly seemed to me as if Maxwell was collateral damage here, although, again, I am open to the idea that she did, in fact, enable some of this, lack of a better term, sex trafficking, which I don't even think technically was sex trafficking. I think the core allegation here is, this is really not disputable, is that Jeffrey Epstein hired a lot of prostitutes, some of whom were underage. That's the essence of this case. And, to me, I mean, okay, that's wrong. That's criminal. That should be punished. But the fact that this is spun so far out of control to being the biggest story all these years later. I mean, Epstein killed himself in 2019. We're in 2025. And somehow this is still this massive a story. I think what's driving this, Tom, is that the masses of this country were promised a public execution of elites. They were promised that. That's how the story began. MAGA saw this as an opportunity to get public execution of elites, because MAGA hates elites other than Donald Trump. They love Donald Trump, but they hate elites in general. And so they have been promised this public execution. We're effectively in medieval times. We're effectively in the French Revolution, where the crowd is thirsting for the guillotine. And that's really what this is all about. That, to me, is what's driving this. The idea that people are being motivated by a desire for justice for the Epstein survivors is a load of crap. It's not about justice for the Epstein survivors. It's about thirst for blood of the elites. And bizarrely, every element of the media, the MAGA media, the left-wing media, the legacy media, everyone is now united in their own different self-interest in this story. And that's why we're going to get blood from the elites when this thing gets released. I don't know who, I don't know how much, but it's going to happen. And my guess is it's not going to be justified.
Okay, well, I told you before we started recording, I'm going to try and be disciplined. I mean, what flashes away right away in what you just said about the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, the key witness didn't testify, just like the boy in the shower never testified for similar reasons in the Sandusky case. So it's starting to seem very, very deja vu. And I know, and let me just say this, you've acknowledged your so-called quote unquote PTSD from the Sandusky case.
Yes.
Is it possible that's biasing you against the allegations that there was more to Epstein than just his own personal use of underage girls?
I think it's possible, but I've already factored that in. I mean, I'm very much aware. I'm probably more aware of my own potential biases than any other commentator, journalist that I know of. I mean, I have a rule that if I want to believe something, or if it fits somehow in my self-interest, that I hold that belief to a much, much higher standard and burden of proof and evidence. And to me, there are just some basic facts involving the Epstein situation that make the current narrative impossible. Like, I'll give you a very simple example. The left's concept that Donald Trump's goose is cooked by this is so ridiculous based upon just two key facts. Number one, there was a Biden administration for 4 years. So the Biden DOJ, which was not hesitant to indict Donald Trump at every opportunity, they did so twice. And, where they knew he was the leading candidate for the Republican Party in the next presidential election, never said a word about these Epstein files, which clearly they had control over for 4 years. Right there, without a really, really, really good explanation, that's game, set, match on that narrative. But if that's not enough for you, we have another fact. Not one Epstein accuser has ever sued Donald Trump. And not only have they not sued him, there's not even one, at least not in recent times, that has even said anything negative about Donald Trump. In fact, whenever given an opportunity, they've only spoken positively of Donald Trump, including Virginia Giuffre, in her book that she released months after killing herself, which happened weeks after she faked the bus accident and claimed she was going to die. I mean, so it's just absurd on its face, the idea that somehow Donald Trump is going to be criminally implicated. Now, is it possible there's going to be something embarrassing in there about Trump? I have no problem believing maybe that might even be a likelihood. But the idea that there's any sort of criminal culpability that's going to be proven involving Donald Trump is absurd. And I think the idea that there's a massive sex trafficking ring is almost as absurd, partially because of the lack of lawsuits. So what? Do people forget that we have a civil court system in this country? Do people not understand that when the media is blowing a hurricane wind behind these accusers and on this story, that any lawsuit against a prominent rich person from one of these Epstein accusers would be a third the moment that they filed it. It wouldn't matter what the facts are. And there would be lots of money to be had. So if this was a sex trafficking ring involving very prominent rich men, where are all the lawsuits? They don't exist, which is inexplicable. So, I mean, those are very difficult facts to get around, Tom. And I just want to go back one more time. Unless Epstein was murdered, which he wasn't. If he was murdered, it would be the easiest crime to solve in the history of murders. Because if you've ever been in a high security prison like this one was, everybody knows where everybody is at every moment. There would only be a handful of people that would even have access to Epstein's cell. Only 2 or 3 potential suspects. Here we are. We're 6 years later. We don't even have a suspect for this alleged murder because it happened.
So, again, you bring up the trafficking ring, and this is something I think someone like me and people who don't care that much about it just let roll off their back. But the idea that Epstein has a client list implies he was running some sort of business and charging clients for these girls, and I did some research on Epstein. He was not a billionaire, by the way, but he was worth about $500 million when he died. So like Mitt Romney money, very rich, had a few high profile clients, very high income, a lot of assets. He's not making money selling underage girls to Bill Gates. Okay, that's one thing.
But the theory, Tom. But the theory is, to be fair, the theory is that he was using that as blackmail on these elite people to help make him money in some mysterious way. That's one of the theories out there, which I understand why that is an attractive theory to people, because in some ways that makes some sense. But again, I go back to, where are the lawsuits? I go back to, why would he kill himself? Okay, see, if you believe that he killed himself, which he did, this is devastating to multiple narratives. Because if he has blackmail information on lots of elite people, including the president of the United States, that's the part of this that is so crazy. That the liberals think that, oh my God, Epstein had it on Trump, yet Trump is president. He's facing federal charges. Trump is the most easily manipulated man in the world if you have leverage on him. All you got to do is just say how great he is, and he's manipulated. And you decide, despite having $500 million and all these great connections and alleged dirt on the elites, including Donald Trump, that he just throws in the towel and kills himself. That's ridiculous. He would never do that if he had that kind of leverage. See, do you see what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. No, I do. And I was going to get to that. I was going to say the superficial thing is he's running some kind of a business. So then the next layer, of course, is this idea that it's some kind of blackmail operation. And then the link to intelligence, whether domestic or foreign, that also kind of reinforces that idea. And I want to bounce a couple things off you that I believe that why people are so invested in this. And I think there's several groups. We talked about the liberals, everybody who's a Democrat, anti-Trump. That's pretty easy to explain. What I don't think other people realize is how much of the religious far right is invested in this idea that the world is run by these globalist pedophiles. And I don't know if you remember, John, back to the first Trump administration, there was this recurring hashtag, 4,000 sealed indictments. And if I'm remembering correctly, the people who were going to be indicted were all these so-called elites that were involved in this worldwide pedophile ring. And that this, by the way, is inspired or involved somehow in Satan worship. And to some people, maybe that literally a supernatural being is affecting this, or at least people who worship Satan are all caught up on this. And that the reason we have a non-functioning $7 trillion monster is because it's being controlled by these
Is this the QAnon Pizzagate thing?
Well, I think that's part of it. And then I think it's wider than that. Just the general obsession with pedophiles. And all during that, again, as a libertarian wanting to, take a hatchet to the federal government. I'm, what what does this have to do with anything? But I think these people believe this is the crux of the issue. So you've got a whole army.
I'm not familiar. Look, I'm aware of that world. I don't have any experience with it. It's hard for me to understand that because Tom, part of what I think puts me in a good position to evaluate this type of story is that I've lived kind of a weird life in that I live an extremely normal middle class life here in Southern California, but I have had a lot of experience with people that are legitimately elite, both in the media as well as in the financial sector. I have dealt with billionaires. I have dealt with very, very famous people in entertainment and in media. And I have a lot of bad things to say about the elites, but the idea that some into pedophilia is not one of them. It's just ridiculous. I mean, it's just not in any way, shape, or form consistent with any experience that I've ever had. And so it's hard for me to understand. But see, where I'm going with this, Tom, is the people you're referring to have never had any contact with the true elites. They've never had any. So they want to hate the elites. And I think we're pretty much saying the same thing. When I say what's driving the Epstein story is that the masses were promised a public execution of elites, is that there's an enormous amount of jealousy, anger, distrust, envy, whatever description you want to use, of the elites. And people love nothing more than seeing someone taken down that, has it better than them. They love it. It's inherent in human nature. And I think that's really what's driving a large part of the obsession with the Epstein story. It's not about truth. It's not about justice.
No, I agree with you. And I think that, sometimes people who are interested in politics write about it, make films about it, probably overestimate the amount of attention that the vast majority of the public pays to the things we care about. And I'll just say, I'll bounce one more thing off you. Like, I come from the Ron Paul wing of the libertarian movement. Okay. And, all the people that you can think of that are somewhat prominent from there, Thomas Massey being one of them, who I know we both like, but I think you'll have something to say about what he's doing with this. But I think there's also this idea, especially with all the murmurs about Epstein's connection to Mossad, that the influence that Israel has over the U.S. government could be mixed up in this whole blackmailing people thing as well. And I guess my problem with that is, okay, maybe he hooked up one or two people and he could have influenced them, but that doesn't explain most of what's going on or not going on with Israel and the U.S. government. Certainly not Jeffrey Epstein and hooking up a few people and getting them on film. What do you think about it?
To me, that whole narrative is pretty darn anti-Semitic, because there is not a shred of evidence that Jeffrey Epstein was ever part of Israeli intelligence or Mossad. I mean, the idea is simply because his name is Epstein and because, the Mossad thing is almost hilarious to me, because the Mossad is so effective in so many of the things that they do. They have this mystique and air of mystery around them, right? They almost have superpowers in the minds of these conspiracy people. So therefore, attaching Epstein to Mossad is perfect because it gives Epstein magic powers, because that's what Epstein needs for their narrative to be true. And if it's Mossad, then that would explain how we could get murdered in a federal prison. How the frick would Mossad into a federal prison and murder Jeffrey Epstein, if that's the allegation, which it seems to be by some people? I mean, it's absurd, almost to the point of hilarity. And so, and to be clear, Israeli intelligence has denied emphatically any connection to Epstein. Of course, people that want to believe this say, that's proof that there was some sort of a connection. Of course, they're going to deny it. Well, what do you want them to do? I mean, so to me, there's no evidence nor logic behind it. And I just think it's another example of how people will concoct anything to substantiate the narrative that they want to believe in.
Yeah. And also, I know that my own allies are desperate to believe that more of the public agrees with them. And what I keep pointing out in my writing and on my podcast is that all of the pillars of the modern gargantuan state had enormous public support. I mean, libertarians point to the income tax, the Federal Reserve, the New Deal, the Great Society. At the time, all those pillars in the modern federal state had enormous public support, and they still do. And there isn't really a large constituency out there to make the government smaller. I mean, I'm preaching we should do it, but I'm pretty realistic about, about why it's not probably going to happen, certainly not under Trump, despite some early, hopes when they were talking about getting rid of federal departments. So, yeah.
Well, Tom, unfortunately, you're right. The reality is, and I'm a libertarian too at heart, there's just no public support for libertarianism. I mean, we are living in a nanny state. We have for a very, very, very long time. It's gotten worse and worse over time, just as many people had predicted that it always would. We may be reaching critical mass. And, in that realm, which is different from the Epstein story, I think we're cooked. I hate to say it, but I think it's over. I think we're done. It's just a matter of how much time we have left and how exactly it's all going to end, especially with the AI revolution staring us in the face.
So Trump signed this bill saying that we have to release more on Epstein. And before I ask you where you think what the results are going to be, let's just talk about a few more similarities to the Sandusky thing. So again, I think, like, for anyone who remembers the Sandusky case, and if you don't, you should go listen to John's podcast. It's like 72 hours long, and I listened to it twice. That's how good it was.
God bless you. God bless you.
And again, okay, right away, the star witness in the case. If you remember the Sandusky case, you remember the boy in the shower. I'll bet if you remember all that, you don't know that the boy in the shower never testified in the case. And yes, they knew who he was. So you can go and learn. That's a very complicated story. You can go learn about that. You also have just kind of this media firestorm and kind of the story taking on a life of its own and people ignoring how implausible the story is. Like it really is, when you stop and think about it rationally, it's implausible that anybody like a Bill Gates or even a Bill Clinton, who's known for his deviancy, would put themselves at risk for what Jeffrey Epstein might be able to provide. Just like it was kind of implausible for Jerry Sandusky to commit all these crimes when he spent so much time coaching football games and traveling. So what other similarities do you see between this and that case?
To me, the Andrew part of the story is almost eerily similar in that Andrew, I believe, and I didn't always believe this, but I'm now 100% convinced. And by the way, what convinced me, put me over the goal line for sure, was an email exchange, actually 2 email exchanges between Epstein and then Prince Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell, which just got released last week in this, recent cache of Epstein estate emails, where Andrew was being told for the first time about this allegation by Virginia Giuffre by Epstein. And Andrew's like, what the hell are you talking about? And Epstein's like, yeah, I know this woman's claimed everybody. She's had sex with everybody but Elvis. That's a quote from Epstein in one of these emails. And it's clear from that this is an innocent man reacting in real time to a false allegation. But that's not the only reason why I believe Andrew was innocent. But the similarity to Sandusky is remarkable in that, Sandusky is thought to be guilty in large part because of a terrible interview that was given to Bob Costas, somebody with whom I'm still in very close contact and I believe has grave doubts about the entire narrative around Penn State, Joe Paterno and Jerry Sandusky himself. Well, Sandusky and Andrew both gave terrible interviews. Andrew gave a bad interview to the BBC, although I don't think Andrew's interview to the BBC, I went back and watched it recently. I don't think it was that bad. But people went into that interview with a completely jaundiced view of the whole Epstein situation. And Andrew was basically in an impossible situation. And I don't think he realized he was in an impossible situation. He just thought he was an innocent man. He's a member of the royal family. The way they live their lives, nothing bad's going to happen to them. They've lived obviously very, very blessed lives. He just wants to tell the truth. He was not well prepared for it. The BBC was extremely biased in their presentation of it. And in both of those situations, these interviews got used as the smoking gun of their guilt, when in reality, there was no actual evidence of their guilt. No direct evidence. The testimonial evidence was terrible. Virginia Giuffre is not a credible person. In fact, so many things we've learned since the Andrew BBC interview. If we had known them at the time, I've said this on my podcast, The Death of Journalism. Can you imagine if we had known when Andrew gave that BBC interview that Virginia Giuffre would make a false allegation against Alan Dershowitz and be forced to retract it legally, and that she would not testify at the Ghislaine Maxwell trial because the prosecutors didn't trust her, and that she would fake a bus accident, claim that her doctors told her she's going to die in 3 or 4 days, which was a lie. Then she's going to kill herself just before she knows she's about to release a book that has all sorts of dubious allegations, doesn't name any names, is not remotely credible using basic journalistic standards. Had we known all that about Virginia Giuffre at the time, I don't think people would have thought that Andrew's interview was that bad at all. I think they would have thought he's trying to be nice. He's trying to be as gentlemanly as he possibly can. And here's the real similarity, which only someone who's been in my position and people who have listened to With the Benefit of Hindsight podcast can properly interpret. The most stark and telling comparison in these two cases is that Penn State University and the royal family act in almost the exact same way when under a media firestorm. They both panic. They both pay settlements with no vetting. They both plead guilty to things that didn't happen on behalf of people that they no longer had an incentive to defend. And they both promoted a false narrative because it's very, very difficult, Tom. And I understand this, although it's still frustrating to me. It's very, very difficult for people in both these cases, in the Sandusky case and the Prince Andrew case, to get beyond the idea that Penn State paid accusers well over $100 million. It's very difficult to get beyond why the royal family paid Virginia Giuffre however much they paid her, into the many millions of dollars. It's very, very difficult. If you understand their perverse self-interest, it's not that difficult. Penn State had an inverse, perverse self-interest to throw everybody under the bus for reasons that I explain in great detail and with the benefit of hindsight. They were actually being praised by the media for what they did. They were spending other people's money to make the people that they fired look bad so that they could justify their panicked decisions when the whole story broke. The royal family, it's slightly different, but Prince Charles, now King Charles, had it out for Andrew. Andrew was Mom, Queen Elizabeth's favorite until this whole thing went down. It was Charles who told Andrew and told Queen Elizabeth, don't let Andrew do this interview. So when it got perceived that Andrew botched the interview, Charles, who's still angst-ridden over the fact that he's being kept from the throne by his mom, sees this as a great opportunity to fulfill multiple agenda items, including basically cutting off his brother's nuts. And so now we have a situation where, in my view, Andrew should be exonerated completely But the royal family has no incentive to do that because they've already paid Virginia Giuffre in a big way. So, and frankly, and I'm sure Andrew, just to keep a roof over his head, has probably agreed to never do another interview. So he can't defend himself, even though there's all this information now that would make a rational person at least revisit this thing, and a logical person go, oh my God, Andrew got railroaded. So the situations are actually remarkably similar, especially when it comes to Prince Andrew and Jerry Sandusky.
Yeah, it strikes me that Andrew is somewhat a Sandusky character, and that he's accused of the actual crime, and he has a bad interview that makes people think he's guilty, or he could also be a Paterno figure in that he's collateral damage and an innocent guy that just, that got steamrolled by the narrative.
That's also a good comparison, I think. Yes. I mean,
Yeah.
there are some differences. The number one thing people need to understand about the Penn State Paterno Sandusky case, and even I have probably been derelict, even though I say this all the time, but it's so important to understanding the whole story. The Paterno angle distracted everybody. It distracted everybody from the core issues of the case, which were the allegations against Sandusky. And the media was immediately completely focused on Paterno and not on Sandusky, which is why there was no chance for the truth of the story ever being found out. And I see where you're going. I could see Andrew as both a Paterno as well as a Sandusky figure in this case. But I am very confident that Andrew did not do anything criminal in this entire affair. But the fact that it's perceived that he was guilty is key to people's perception of the larger narrative. Because if they got Prince Andrew, right, who else is in those files? That is a huge part of this narrative, in my opinion.
And finally, I guess there's some date in December where all this is supposed to be released by, but you don't think it's just a nothing burger that's going to happen when they come out. You think that it's going to be worse than a nothing burger.
I think it'll be what should be a nothing burger, but I think it'll be made into something else because the incentive structures, I'm a big believer in incentive structures. The incentive structures here for too many people with too much power, especially when it comes to the media, is to make something out of this because they're all invested now. So they can't admit this was all about nothing. They're going to have to find something in there. The narrative of, they whitewashed the files is not going to hack it. I mean, it's going to hack it with some people, with the real crazies. But, so they're going to do two things, Tom. There's going to be they whitewashed the files. The real stuff wasn't released. And what gets released is going to be manipulated and misinterpreted and blown out of proportion in order to muddy the water enough to where nobody has to admit they got duped. And if that means innocent people get destroyed, so be it, because no one gives a damn anymore.
Yeah. And just the last Sandusky parallel, if Epstein is Sandusky, but guilty in this case, and Prince Andrew's Joe Paterno, you've also got Graham Spanier from the Sandusky case and the two other administrators, don't remember their names. We're all really they went to jail for not a long time, but shouldn't have been accused at all. They lost their jobs. Their lives were ruined over something that was at its base untrue. And there's the potential for that here for several other so-called elites.
Well, you could certainly make an argument that Graham Spanier, former president of the Penn State, who went to prison in the Sandusky case, which was beyond absurd. Even if Sandusky was guilty, it would have been ridiculous. Yeah. Spanier never even had a conversation with Sandusky or McQueary. He's on a couple of emails that are vague. I mean, it's just complete. And I've attended the Graham Spanier trial. It was completely ridiculous. And Graham Spanier knows, although he's never admitted it publicly, that Jerry Sandusky is innocent. But I think Graham is a really nice guy. He's unfortunately exceedingly liberal, but there's a comparison with already happened in the last week where the former president of Harvard, Larry Summers, not Larry Sanders. That would have been something if it was Larry Sanders. Larry Summers, if Larry Summers has just had his career destroyed, I don't think he's going to go to prison because he didn't do anything remotely criminal, but just because there was some emails with him being chummy and asking for Epstein's advice. And now, we're going through his history of visits to Epstein Island at a time where nobody thought Epstein was a negative, there was nothing negative about being in Epstein's realm, is just ridiculous. But, we got the former president of Penn State going down, the former president of Harvard going down. And I don't think Larry Summers is the last one that's going to suffer because of this, regardless of what the facts of the logic are.
Well, we'll have to see. I hope this is the first one you're wrong on, John. I think you're right on your general thesis of the case. Hopefully something will stop the witch hunt once it gets rolling, but we'll find out.
What would that be? What would that be? What would stop the witch hunt? How could this possibly, this is a snowball coming down a mountain into an avalanche. I mean, I can't even imagine what would stop it. Really? I mean, what would have to be in those files for the avalanche to stop? I mean, it's hard for me to imagine.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And it's kind of tragic. A sudden moment of clarity among hundreds of millions of Americans. They're being bamboozled again, but not very likely. We'll see when they come out. And I'm going to direct everybody again, folks, the podcast where John covers this in greater detail is The Death of Journalism. I believe it's episode 268. We'll link to it. Go and take a listen. And John, appreciate you coming on. Hope you'll be back soon.
Thanks, Tom. Anytime.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.